Welcome everyone. We are going to do another video today. I am going to be doing the introduction to psychology video with you today, and today's lesson is going to tell you about what psychology is, because a lot of students have been asking me that I want to know what the subject is all about, what is the CAIE syllabus all like, what are the objectives, what is how do we attempt questions. So I'm going to be covering and the past papers. So I'm going to be covering a bit about how the past paper pattern is, and what are the type of papers, what are the type of questions, and what is the syllabus all about, right? That is the most important area that will be covering. So let's begin our today's lesson. Okay, so what is this? All right. So, introduction to psychology. So, the first thing which I ask my students when I start the class is that when you hear the word psychology, what comes to your mind? And you can do the same right now for yourself, and just take a moment and think about what really comes to your mind when you think about psychology. What is psychology? Because everybody wants to do psychology, but do you really know what psychology is? So when I ask my students what is psychology, the mostly the answer that I get from them is mad people. It's about mad people. We study them. It's about therapy, those who are mentally sick, um, or have mental issues, or psychopaths or serial killers. Or it's about depression and Prozac and all of these antidepressants. Or it's about addiction, and it could be many, many more. Um, and predominantly, I get this, that it is counseling and therapy. So, I've taken psychology because I want to become a counselor or a therapist. I want to become a clinical psychologist. So these are the main, attractions which mostly the students are going towards. But the syllabus, yes, I would say that you all, if you kind of came up with the same answers, you are more or less right in the way. But this is not the whole of psychology. It's a very limited part of psychology. Psychology is a very, very vast field. So we are going to cover a lot of areas beyond these as well. So why study psychology? What are the objectives by the CAI? So first of all, psychology is about humans, right? So you will get to understand humans better. That is something which all of us are aiming at when we take the course in psychology. And I often, this is one of my favorite jokes, and I often share this joke with my students that who's a psychologist? I ask them. And, and after they have come up with their own fancy definitions, and I put the joke up for them and ask them that, a psychologist actually is a man or a woman who watches everyone else when a beautiful woman enters the room. So if you do that, then you definitely are a psychologist. So what's in it for you? First of all, you'll get to know that why do we do what we do. We get wider perspective towards understanding human and animal behavior and interactions. And I'm going to elaborate on all of these points. Ability to analyze human behavior from different angles and different perspectives. Awareness of predominant approaches towards understanding human behavior. The approaches that we are going to be covering in the CAI syllabus are cognitive, biological, learning, and social. There used to be 5 approaches, but now these have been yes, these are 5 approaches. There used to be 2 more. Developmental was part of it, and but it has been kind of removed now. Okay, so and also in the A2 syllabus, right, certain courses have been removed. For example, education psychology has been removed now. which I'm going to go to when we are going to do A2 syllabus. So let's take an example to understand what I was just talking about, right? So I'm going to take a very simple example. When you think about depression, it's a very common word and so many people are using it nowadays. What really, you think about when it's depression? So what does CIE want you to think about depression like? Let's take a moment to understand that. So first of all, right, if I ask you what is depression, you might say that, oh yeah, it's about the disturbance in neurochemicals, right? There are certain neurotransmitters in the brain which go haywire, or in terms of their production or in terms of the transmission. So these are serotonin and dopamine. Maybe you know this, and then you would say that, oh yes, probably it's genetic also. There are certain genes which are responsible or which predispose you if you have those genes towards being depressed, right? If you get the kind of an environment which triggers it. So that is one aspect of looking at depression, right? This is called the biological. So if we are going to look at any kind of behavior, we are going to look at it from multiple angles. And that's what CAI wants you to understand and know, that you are going to have a very wide and holistic perspective about human functioning. Then there is cognitive. So what is cognitive explanation of depression? Cognitive, basically the person behind cognitive psychology is Aaron Beck, and he did a lot of work in terms of cognitions. And according to him, depression is because you people or anybody who is depressed has got negative cognitions or faulty cognitions or biases. Okay, and what are these cognitive biases? So there are a lot of them, but I will just highlight a few of them which are relevant in the case of depression. First of all, right, let me explain. It's number one is all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking. So if I'm not perfect, then I've failed. Okay, so you have to be perfect, otherwise you have failed, right? Either I do it right or I don't do it at all. So these kind of people, right, if you have a mindset like this, right, you are most likely to get depressed. So think about it. Personalization is another very, very common defense mechanism. Sorry, why did defense mechanism come into my mind? It's a very, very common cognitive bias, which is that it's all my fault. So basically, Beck has said that there is a certain sort of thought processes which are behind depression. And one thought process is that you immediately personalize everything is because of you. The world's revolving around you, and everything which is happening is because of you. You are at fault. Okay, so blaming yourself or taking responsibility for something that wasn't completely your fault. So if, for example, if your friend did not answer you back on the phone or texted you or ignored you in person, you would think about that, oh, this person has started hating me, it's all about me. Okay, and there's certain shoulds and musts also, which are also responsible. And sometimes it's magnification or catastrophizing. That means you blowing things out of proportion. And then so like, for example, the coronavirus is here, and now these times are very depressing for a lot of people, because they are catastrophizing and they are saying that, oh, it will never go away and it's going to be terrible, right? That is jumping to conclusions also, right? Over here you can see that so you have to an emotional reasoning and not factual reasoning. So you can pause it, take a moment and read all of these, and you'll get a better understanding of what cognitive biases are. So if you have a cognitive bias, about yourself, that you are, it is specific to you, that is all because of your fault, and it's always going to be like that, and it's never going to change. So then you are most likely to get depressed. Okay. Now we go to the learning approach, right? So what is the learning approach? The person behind the learning approach is Aaron Beck. He is a very, very popular psychologist, and I'm going to put up a link of his talk, of his TED talk, which is very famous TED talk on positive psychology, and you guys must look at it, and let me know how did you find it. Go through it. It's a very interesting talk. So this guy, right, says that, why people are depressed, because people have learned to to be helpless. People have learned that not to control, that they have learned that they don't have any control over the situation, and they cease to resist. If the suffering is there, they don't prevent the suffering, and they cease to resist the suffering also. So how did he come up with this conclusion? It's a very, very popular experiment of his, in which he used dogs, and you can see that over here there is this or you can see that there is this dog, right? And this is a box, and in this box, there was there were electrodes over here, or something which could electrocute the dog. Whenever the dog tried to escape the situation, the dog was unable to go to the other side. But later on, after several repetitions, he kind of removed the electrocution and the electric shock, which was not very, very painful, but it was unpleasant for the dog, and the dog ceased to go to the other side, because the dog had become helpless, and he said that, this is my suffering and I can never get out of it, and there's no use doing anything about it. Even when the dog could escape the situation, the dog did not escape the situation. So how do we apply this to depression? So basically, in depression also, people have the same thought process. They think that they are helpless, they can't escape the situation, they can't prevent the suffering, and they just don't do anything, right? And that's why they get depressed, and they don't feel empowered in life. Okay, so another aspect of understanding depression is from the social perspective. So what do social psychologists would say, or those who look at from the social side, any behavior would say that, oh, don't forget the influence of the society, the culture, the norms, the values, the dysfunctional family, maybe what sort of a family this person has, what sort of a friend circle this person has, or the workplace, how toxic is the workplace, how healthy is the workplace, what sort of country a person is coming from, a society, what's the socioeconomic condition over there, what's the economy like. So all of these things influence a person's well-being, and consequently can affect the person's functioning in an adverse manner. So this comes to a very important point, which was part of the course also, but I would like to refer to it over here. That, for example, it's quite relevant right now when I'm thinking about that. Okay, women, they say, are depressed more. Okay, so why is depression more prevalent in women? Okay, so major depression is a chronic illness, right? And it says that the prevalence of major depression is higher in women than men. In 2010, its global annual prevalence was 5.5% and 3.2% respectively, representing about 1.7-fold greater incidence in women. So what we are saying is that, why is this greater incidence in women, and why women are more predisposed to being depressed? What do you think? Take a moment and think about it. That why would women be more? So some people will say, yes, of course, there are hormones involved, and they have these certain hormones which predispose them, and there's this postnatal depression. Yes, that is true, but social psychologists will look at it from the perspective of life circumstances and the culture. So unequal power status, right? Women are much more likely than men to live in poverty, and causing concerns such as community and healthcare resources. And also these issues can cause feelings of negativity, low self-esteem, and lack of control over life. Then work overload, right? Women have got a lot of different type of responsibilities, and they've got to play so many roles, be it of the mother, of the wife, or the caregivers for their aging parents. So women have to do so much for everyone, and be a perfect wife, and be a perfect mother, and be a perfect friend, and a perfect daughter. That is something. These are the musts and the shoulds that they have to live by. Otherwise there's so much guilt and shame in certain societies, and that is one of the reasons why they go into depression. And most of the cases when I have seen in my clinical work is the relationships which are causing depression to the people. The environment is so toxic and so demanding. For example, in Pakistani society, there is this color complex, and if you are born dark, or if you are towards a wheatish complexion, then girls do not get married, and they are considered to be not so pretty, and and all of these petty things, and these values and norms of a culture affect their well-being and their emotional health. So they get depressed, and they have low self-esteem issues. Then sexual and physical abuse. Women who were emotionally, physically, and sexually abused as children or adults are more likely to experience depression at some point in their lives, and than those who haven't. This is what research has found. And women are more likely than men to experience sexual abuse, and that is also another fact. So these are some of the reasons why women have depression, okay, other than the biological causes. So as student of psychology, you're expected to develop this attitude and mindset towards looking at human behavior. So when you're going to look at human behavior, you're going to look at it from all perspectives, from all angles. Um, and this is a holistic view of human behavior. And we are not going to have any deterministic or reductionist view that everything is, determined by biology, everything is determined by, the social context or learning or cognitions, but it is everything is mixed up. It's a very complex, human beings are very complex species, and you've got to understand them with all of their complexities, right? So this comes to the definition of psychology. So what's the definition of psychology? Psychology is a scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So when we use the word scientific, psychology is based on facts, okay? And the finding of psychology are, how do we find whatever we find out, or whatever are the facts, and the concepts in psychology or the phenomena that you will learn, they are all based on research. Okay, so right now I shared a research paper with you guys in which they were saying that there's more prevalence of depression in women, and this was gathered very objectively. It was measured, and statistically quantified. There are certain statistical measures that you're required to know, but it's very basic, so don't freak out about that. It's the arithmetic mean, the standard deviation, the correlation coefficient, and certain types of graphs that you're supposed to know that how do we represent the data through graphs. So there's a bar, a graph. There is also a scatter diagram. So there are different type of statistics and statistical analysis which you would be coming across as well. Then also, these there are facts and there are quantitative facts. So for example, I mentioned the percentage, the and how much it was different for the genders. So this is quantitative, right? When you quote everything in numbers, and so there will be a lot of quantitative data involved so that you can make comparisons. There'll be qualitative data as well. For example, I can go to the women, right, and ask them and interview them, and they are going to tell me stuff about their life, and that will be qualitative data. And that can be also analyzed at what's happening in their life, what's their story about. Okay, so what is the goal of psychology? The goal of psychology is to understand human behavior or animal behavior, explain it, modify it, manipulate it. Manipulate not in a bad way. Manipulation means that you manipulate the IV and the TV, that we're going to do when we do the research methods. And then there is control it and predict it. So control and predict, right, is part of the scientific procedure, and I'm going to cover that hopefully very soon in the research lesson, which I'm going to do with you all. So types of research, right? The types of research that you're supposed to know is field research, lab research, longitudinal snapshot case studies, and self-report measures, surveys, questionnaires, tests, psychometrics. All of these we are going to do. Now let's come to the divisions of psychology. As I told you, psychology is a very, very vast field. So, don't limit it only to clinical psychology. That is just one part of it. For example, I will give you some examples. Let's say there are certain types of um, certain fields, right, or divisions of psychology. For example, there's military psychology, there's forensic psychology, there is behavior analysis, there's developmental psychology, experimental psychology, then there is health psychology, then there is let's say what else is a bit different for you guys. There's family psychology, there's law psychology, there is neuro psychology, or and there is pediatric psychology, there's trauma psychology, and sports psychology. So there are lots and lots of different branches of psychology. There's cross-cultural psychology. Okay, so you can go through all of these divisions. There are 56 according to APA, that is American Psychological Association. Okay, so but what about the money, right? If you're going to become, going to pursue this, right? Are you going? Is it going to give you a stable income? Is it a good subject to take in order to ensure your career paths, what sort of career paths you can have. So you can basically become a clinical psychologist. That's pretty obvious. Then you can also go to the business field. You can go into the HR, because that is a lot of wherever there's a lot of human interaction and communication and understanding of human behaviors involved. So you can go into marketing and understand human behavior there. Consumer psychology, organizational psychology is there. So you can become an organizational psychologist, you can become a forensic psychologist, you can become a child psychologist, you can become an educational psychologist. So there are lots of fields. You can work with NGOs, and you can work in clinical settings also, obviously. So these are some of the areas which you can later pursue after taking psychology as a subject in your university as well. Okay, so now I've got an activity for you guys, right? And you need to pause the video when you have to attempt this exercise. Okay, so let's begin. I hope you will enjoy this exercise. So let's be a psychologist for a while. Let's see if we can become a psychologist. Okay. So now I want you all to see, look at all of this, right? And all of these pictures, A, B, C, D, E, F, and evaluate these pictures in terms of intelligence, trustworthiness, warmth, friendliness, sociability, happiness, virtuousness, wealth, attractiveness, and life success. So there are lots of it, right? You can basically take all of them, but it's not feasible right now to take all of them. So what we're going to do is we are going to just take 4 characteristics. So yeah, I want you all to rate all of these pictures in terms of attractiveness, that how attractive you find them, how happy do you think these people are in their life, that means how satisfied they are in their life, and how intelligent they are, right? I want you to write down about that. And also how warm and friendly they are. And you have to score all of the participants on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of these characteristics. So 1 is the lowest and 5 is the highest. And And just take a moment, right? I'm going to go back and just look at all of these, right? That people from different socioeconomic background, there are people from different cultures, right? Different races over here. Just take a moment and see how intelligent do you think they are, how happy they are in life, how warm and friendly they are, okay? And and how attractive they are, right? So basically the pattern I see mostly now, when you have done your rating, take a moment and do your rating. And whenever you're done with the rating, right? I have this sample rating, which I did with my students. And in this, right, you can see that the ones who are most attractive, for example, B and D, they got really high, and even F got really high scores in terms of attractiveness, like 5 on a scale of 0 to 5. These were, surprisingly, these were perceived by the people to be more happy in life, to be more intelligent, and to be more warm and friendly. So can you imagine that, how is that possible, right? How, just because of their looks, right? How can you ensure that these people are happy also, and these are smart also, and these are warm and friendly people? So this is called the halo effect, right? This is one very important concept in psychology. And so what is the halo effect, right? It was given by Edward Thorndike. You can pause it and see that what is the halo effect. It says that one particular characteristic of a person dominates all other characteristics, right? And so if the person, and this is basically a correlational analysis. That means they have seen it occurring together. If people are good looking, right? They tend to be more smarter also, or more happier in life also. And but it is not a cause and effect relationship. That means if you're born beautiful or handsome, if you've got really good looks and God was in a generous mood, and you've got a good genetics, that's why you are going to be happy in life, and you are going to be warm and friendly, and you're going to be also very intelligent. So intelligence is not dictated by looks, and looks do not so it is not a cause and effect relationship, but this is a correlational relationship. Correlation means that two things occur together, and they've been seen to be occurring together. So this brings us to the next important topic, that is the syllabus. Okay, so what is the 999 syllabus all about? Mine one is over here stating from 2020 till 2020, but this syllabus is more or less the same in 2021 and 22 and 23. So don't worry about that. I have gone through that syllabus also. There are not any changes whatsoever, but very few and minor ones, which we're going to deal with it when we are going to cover more courses and more topics. So now I want you to just take a moment and look at what the paper are type, right? Paper types are. There's paper one, which is 1.5 hour paper, and you have to answer all questions at AS level, right? There's weighting also, which have been mentioned over here. So you can see that it has a weightage. And also, I want you to remember one more thing, that there's paper two. In paper two, there's first one is about approaches, issues, and debates, right? The next one is about research methods. Okay, so what are the research methods? Again, this is also paper two, is 1.5 hours long, and you've got 3 sections in it, right? So section A is short answer questions based on the core studies. Then section B is scenario based questions, and section C is design based questions. Okay, so all of these sections, right, we're going to cover all of these different types of questions when I'm gonna make more videos, and I'm gonna tell you how you're going to attempt these questions. Then there's paper three. Paper three has got two questions, and from two specialized choices. There are four specialist choices. I'm gonna show you guys the specialist choices which are available right now by the CAI. And also I want you to look at the type of questions which are going to come from these selected choices. So out of four choices, you're going to have two choices, and out of those two choices, you're going to attempt the question one is about divided into three parts, and it's a 12 mark, and question two is a structured essay based on the questions divided into parts again. Okay, so this is basically paper one breakdown, that there are 9 questions as you can see. Okay, and you know, there are 2-mark questions, there are 4-mark questions, 5-mark question, 8-mark question, and the biggest question is the last one, which is an evaluation question, and it is basically a 10-mark question. Okay, and then I have already discussed paper 2 questions with you guys, and paper 3 paper 2 questions, that is scenario based, design based, and short questions. Then paper 4, right, paper 4 has got 2 specialist choices, and I also discussed that with you guys. Okay, so let's go to what is the syllabus about, right? So first of all, right, you know, there are some core studies that you're supposed to know under different approaches. So we talked about the biological approach, and if you remember something from the biological approach, that how did we explain depression, right? We said that depression is because there are some neurochemicals which have gone haywire, or which are not functioning well, or which are not present, or which are being excreted, right, you know, which are very little in the brain. Okay, so this is one way of looking at behavior. So behavior, cognitions, emotions can be explained in terms of the working of the brain, okay, and the effect of the hormones. And then similarities and differences in people can be understood in terms of biological factors and their interaction with other factors. Okay, so we're going to first look at the biology, that everything is okay in the biology. If biology is dictating this behavior, how is it doing it? Okay, so researches or the studies which are under this biological approach are very interesting. Take a moment and look at these. Like have a sip of water. Okay, so Canley et al. Is the first study, right? And it is about brain and emotions. So it is basically is concerned with that what part of the brain is responsible for emotions and what part of the brain is responsible for memory. So Canley et al. Study is based on understanding the link between amygdala and the connection between amygdala and activation of emotions in long-term recall, and it includes considering functional magnetic resonance imaging. So basically, right, you know, they put people into the fMRI, and they measured their brain activity, and they saw that which part of the brain was being activated when they were exposed to stimuli which were emotionally intense, and in terms of their emotional intensity, whether they were negatively intense, whether they were provoking negative emotions, which were intense negative emotions, or neutral emotions, what parts got activated, and when there were positive images, what parts got activated. So Canley et al., right, you know, they studied that, and then they came to the conclusion that the amygdala is responsible for you know, these kind of emotions which are concerned with fight, flight, and freeze responses, and then how much amygdala is activated, and is that in any way affecting our recall and registration of those experiences, and if it is doing it, right, to what extent it is doing it. So what is the correlation again, that how much amygdala is being activated by what kind of stimuli, and then how much of those stimuli are recalled based on the level of amygdala activation. So we are going to do that and study all of these three relationships, and what is magnetic resonance imaging all about, fMRI. So you will get to know a little bit about that as well. Then there is Dement and Kleitman study. This has been a very old study. It's been part of the syllabus since quite a while. It's about dreaming. So, the phenomena of dreaming is kind of alluring and attractive to a lot of students. When as soon as I start this lesson, they just get so, wide-eyed and so interested. So, what aspect of dreaming are we going to study? Well, that's important. We are going to study the biology underlying dreaming. That what's happening in the brain when we are dreaming. So, what sort of activity happens is and there are certain phases which are REM, and that is REM stage, and there is non-REM stage of sleep, in which there are different types of sleeping occurs in the REM stage, and not so much in the non-REM, and that was basically right proven in this study by Dement and Kleitman, and then they also showed that how you can measure the EEG at different times of the night when the person is sleeping. What is the EEG waves like during REM, and how are they like during non-REM? And so this is called um, so REM is basically a rapid eye movement, okay, and non-REM is non-rapid eye movement. Okay, so they were studying that when people were dreaming, were their eyes moving, right? And if their eyes were moving, how were they moving, right? What direction were they moving in? And then, is that how much is that correlated with dreaming? Okay, so another one is Schachter and Singer. This is also a very popular one study. It's an old one, it's a classic study, and it is basically concerned with emotions. So when we talk about emotions, everybody is so excited to learn about emotions as well, right? So psychologists have come up with different theories of emotions, and one of the theory which we are going to study is the two-factor theory of emotion. So what is the two-factor theory of emotion? It says that how do we experience emotion? It just wants you to understand that how am I going to explain that what's my emotion like, right? How do I feel my emotion? So I've just put in up a small example as to how the two-factor theory looks at emotion. For example, if you are fearful, okay, so how do you come to the conclusion that I'm scared? So if there is a gun in front of you, right, that is a stimulus that has happened in the environment. You get this stimulus of a gun, and then your heart starts beating. So there's biology involved, stage 2, and then stage 3. What happens is that you think about that. Oh my God, why is my heart beating? So you come to the conclusion that, oh, that's because of the gun, right? I'm in a threat state right now, and I better run, or I better be scared, I better attack back, or whatever, right? So or save myself. So you feel the emotion of fear. So that's how they explain emotion. Emotion is just not biology, but biology also along with the cognitions which are from the environment. Okay, so the same biology can give you different cognitions. For example, your heart would be beating and racing, not and in conclusion, you will not have fear, but you will have excitement and happiness. You can also have the same underlying biology and have different emotions. You will feel as if you are in love, or when you have exercised, you are so euphoric and your heart is beating so strongly. It doesn't mean that you are in a fearful state. So the cognitions from the environment are very important in order to label the emotion. Then there is the cognitive approach. So what is the cognitive approach about? Let's take a moment to look at the studies. So now you can see the first study is, okay, what does cognitive approach first of all look at? the behavior, right? This is all very important for you to understand that what is the cognitive approach saying about behavior. The cognitive approach says that behavior and emotions can be explained in terms of the role of cognitive processes such as attention, language, thinking, and memory. Okay, these are some of the cognitive processes that we are going to be studying. And what are the cognitive processes that we will study? I'm just going to highlight those right now. And similarities and differences between people can be understood in terms of these individual patterns of cognitions. The first cognition that we will try to understand is attention and memory. Okay, and how is that influenced by doodling? Okay, so Andrade was interested to find out why do people doodle, right? You must have seen yourself doodling, sometimes in class when you're bored, and or you are daydreaming or something like that, and you start doodling. And so why do people do that? Basically, Andrade wanted to find out that what's the connection between doodling. Is it serving a function? Is it there for a purpose, or is just an aimless activity? So according to this study, right, doodling can assist a person's concentration and memory. Okay, so that's what was proven by Andrade in this study. Then there's Baron Cohen study, right? It's a very important study. It's about cognition, and the specific cognition that you will understand over here is the theory of mind, which autistic people do not have, or which is compromised in individuals who are facing the disorder of autism or Asperger's syndrome. Okay, so what happens in theory of mind? Theory of mind is basically an ability to understand that other people have emotions and cognitions other than my own, and be able to understand them and to recognize them, emotions in others, and also to infer from them and then direct your behavior according to that inference. That why this person is behaving like that, because the person is feeling like that, and therefore how would I react to that particular thing. So basically, if you are able to identify, looking at the set of eyes, person's emotions. For example, there's a set of eyes, and he gave this test to his participants, and the participants had to score from four options, one of them to be correct, as to what is the eyes showing. So for example, the four options over here is surprised, joking, happy, sure about something. So this test is also available online. It's a very interesting test, and I will put it up in the links below, and then you can do it for yourself and see what score do you get and how strong your theory of mind is. So it is basically showing that those people who are towards the autistic spectrum have a compromised theory of mind. And that means their brain is of a 3-year-old, because the theory of mind develops at around 4-year-old, 4 to 5-year-old period. So what about Laney et al.? Laney et al. Is about false memories. So implanting false memories. So basically, it may sound very high tech, right? That, oh God, we are implanting false memories. But yes, psychologists have been doing that. They've been implanting false memories, and there are certain leaders in this field. One of them is Laney et al. And what did these guys do is that they investigated the effect of false memories of a suggestion. So basically, what they did was that they got a group of people and they told them that, hello, you guys, you just loved asparagus when you were younger. And I'm going to give you asparagus right now. How much are you going to pay for it? Are you going to eat it? Do you like it? And stuff like that. And, and if I'm going to, and which was false, right? They did not like asparagus when they were young. But false memory was created in such a way that they started believing in it, that yes, this happened and this can have implications with regard to healthy food eating. So basically, people did start liking stuff which they believed they liked as children. So false memories, right, and how do they can influence your present current behavior. So it has implications in real life scenarios also, in terms of helping people develop better healthy eating styles. Okay, so this learning approach is also very interesting, and the studies under the learning approach are the main assumptions, first of all, of the learning approach is that conditioning helps to explain changes in behavior. We're going to understand what is conditioning. I'm not going to go into it right now in this lecture. Then there is social learning helps to explain changes in behavior. So the first study is Bandura et al. It's a classic study. It was done in the 60s by Bandura and Ross. Um, so they wanted to understand that what is aggression about, right? And is an aggression learned, or is it inborn? And if it is learned, how is it learned, and how what sort of learning takes place? So this is social learning, that is learning through imitation. So they kind of expose these kids to aggressive models and non-aggressive models, and then they saw that whether the kids did the same aggressive acts towards a bobo doll, which they had seen, and to what extent they did and to what extent they did not. So, and then there is Saavedra and Silverman. Saavedra and Silverman has got button phobia study, and the button phobia study is a case study of this child who had button phobia. Okay, it's very unusual phobia. You must be all very surprised, and every time I talk about button phobia study, students are very surprised because it's a rare phobia, and but it is there, and it's becoming more and more common. So the study shows the use of classical conditioning to treat the child's phobia. And what is classical conditioning? I'm not going to go into it right now, but you will study. This is a type of a learning, okay, that is learning through association. Then there is Pepperberg. Pepperberg is about Alex, right? Alex is a very, very popular bird. You can YouTube it and see there's so many videos of Alex. Alex was a very smart parrot, and it was not born smart, but it was just an ordinary parrot which Pepperberg picked up, and she trained him in so many things. And one of the things that he learned to do was to understand abstract concepts of same and different. And in this you're going to see that where was the parrot able to understand abstract concepts like what is same and what is different, and also different characteristics of different things which were exposed to them. Okay, so then this comes to the social approach now. I hope you don't have any questions. If you have questions, please do feel free to write them down in the comments below. And I'm going to make sure that I answer your queries and help you out in whatever way I can. You can also reach out to me for assistance for tuition. I give tuitions to students from all around the world, one-on-one tuitions, and which are very need-based and according to what you require. And so let's go to the social approach. What does the social approach look at? It looks at human behavior in terms of how others influence your emotions and cognitions and behaviors. And behaviors, emotions, and cognitions can be influenced by groups and social contexts. Okay, so we looked at the society, we looked at the economy, we looked at other people around the person who are responsible in some way to make a person feel that way. So there's Milgram study. Milgram wanted to study obedience to authority figure and how much obedient people would be to electrocute another person if they are told to do so by someone in authority position. Then Pilyavin study is about helping behavior. So social psychologists are also interested in such phenomena as to what makes people help, what factors influence helping behavior, what sort of variables will be influencing the person's tendency towards helping or not helping, what kind of race would get more help, what kind of personality would get more help, and and how many people will help, and having another helper help, or so basically understanding bystanders behavior. And also it includes some understanding of diffusion of responsibility, the phenomena of the diffusion of responsibility, that what happens if there are more people around, will the likelihood of helping increase or decrease. Then there is Yamamoto et al. This is chimpanzee helping. So yeah, I told you that psychology is also concerned with animal behavior. So over here, you're going to understand that how did Yamamoto et al. Study is based on chimpanzees helping and how they um, can they understand the needs of another chimpanzee. If the other chimpanzee is going to ask for help, are they going to help their buddy or not? And if they are going to help, what will that help, what will ensure their helping behavior? Will it be need based? Will it be focused on the needs? Will it where if the other chimpanzee will demand it in a particular way, then the other chimpanzee is going to help or not? So all of these things are seen in this study. So I have already covered with you the details of different approaches and issues. You can pause and look at it one more time and get a kind of a taste of, or what the paper is going to be about. Paper 3, paper 4, all of these, and then we come to um, the last part of this lecture is about A2. So what is the A2 syllabus about? You have got consumer psychology, you've got health psychology, you've got industrial psychology, or organizational psychology, and abnormal psychology. So I teach abnormal psychology and health psychology, okay? And so these are the two options that I will be putting up videos on as well very soon on my channel. So stay tuned and subscribe to my channel so that you get to know whenever I upload a new video. And also please do share and do like my videos, and it will motivate me to put up more of my lessons. So yes, and reach out to me if you need my assistance in any way. So let's taste a bit of social psychology research. Um, Okay, so Stanley Milgram, right? We already did that one, right? So I'm not gonna go into the detail of Stanley Milgram study, and we are going to just fast forward a little bit. So sometimes psychological research are not very yummy to eat to have around. For example, we talk about people electrocuting other people, and would they do it, right? And they do it, right? And you are like, questioning humanity all of a sudden all over together. So there are some things which you will study. You can also there's also a very popular study about love, and which I'm gonna look at, right? At what is the love portion. So it is basically a laboratory study, which I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but you can Google this, and it is also on YouTube. You have the video of this Capilano suspension bridge, and it's a perfect love laboratory. So if you want to go for a date, you must go there, and it will ensure that you will fall in love with the other person. So this was a social research, and it is also field research because it was conducted in a real world setting. And in the end, I hope the first bite of psychology was kind to you. And maybe you are feeling like this right now and has left you wanting for more. Welcome to the human race. Goodbye.